I drove to my second property to show it to a prospective tenant on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a little past 3, and the Nashville sky had that particular white haze of March that sits between winter and spring without committing to either. When I opened the gate, I heard music. When I came around the side of the house, I saw smoke rising from the grill. And when I stepped onto the back porch, I found my daughter-in-law's parents sitting in my chairs, drinks in hand, while a half-dozen of their relatives laughed and danced inside my living room. They saw me. Neither of them stood up. Her mother smiled the way you smile at a neighbor who shows up without calling ahead and said, "Relax, our daughter already thinks of this place as hers." Her father added, laughing, not even taking off his sunglasses, "Sooner or later, all of this stays in the family anyway." I stood in the entrance to that porch for about 40 seconds. I looked at the drinks, at the smoke, at the shoes scattered across the floor I'd refinished myself 4 years earlier. Then I said it was fine, that there must be some misunderstanding, that I'd take care of it. I closed the gate, got in my truck, sent the prospective tenant a message saying I'd need to reschedule. But before I tell you what happened that night and what I spent the next several weeks uncovering, I need to explain who I was before any of this started. If you're hearing this story for the first time, welcome. Subscribe to the channel. What you're going to hear isn't about revenge. It's about what a man discovers when he stops building for everyone else and starts looking at what he built for himself. Hit like, leave a comment. Now let me take you back to Nashville, March of 2023, and introduce you to who I was. My name is Dale Mercer. I'm 52 years old. I grew up in Clarksville, came down to Nashville at 24 after a few years working claims for a regional insurance company and never left. I spent the first decade learning the industry from the inside, sitting across from adjusters, learning how fraud gets built and how it gets found. At 39, I went independent. Set up my own firm out of an office in East Nashville, just me and an assistant named Patty, who had worked with me for 11 years and who knew where every file, every case number, every deposition transcript was better than I did. It was mine. Every case signed with my name, every problem solved with my own head. I liked working with my hands outside of the office. On Saturday mornings, I drove out to the property on Gallatin Pike, an old Victorian that I'd been slowly restoring for 3 years, not to flip, just because I liked the work. I'd pull on work gloves and spend 4 or 5 hours replacing trim, patching plaster, doing the kind of patient repair that doesn't show up on any invoice. My assistant used to say I was the only insurance investigator she knew who showed up to depositions with paint under his fingernails. I told her that was a sign the weekend had been productive. She told me I was impossible. That wasn't stubbornness. It was the way I made sure that what I built actually held. Outside of work, I was simple. I cooked on Sundays. I made a slow-cooked pot roast with vegetables that my older son said was the best thing he'd ever eaten. And he was 29 and had lived in 3 cities, so I figured he had some basis for comparison. I didn't entirely believe him, but I liked hearing it. Every father does. I had 2 sons. Caleb, 29, married to Brianna. She's the daughter-in-law I mentioned, living in an apartment in Germantown that I'd help finance when they got married. That was my way of helping, not with advice, but with what I knew how to do, which was make the numbers work. Then there was Owen, 24, finishing up a degree in criminal justice at Belmont, working part-time doing background checks for a staffing firm downtown. Quiet, observant, more like me than his mother, though I never said that out loud. And there was Sandra Pruitt Mercer, 48 years old, CFO of Riverside Medical Center, a private hospital on the west side of Nashville. 400 beds, a well-regarded cardiac unit, the kind of institution that appears on lists of best employers in the state. She'd climbed to that position over 20 years, starting as a financial analyst straight out of Vanderbilt, working through every rung of hospital administration. She was genuinely good at it. She understood how to read a balance sheet, how to manage a board, how to talk to physicians who thought finance was someone else's problem. I had real respect for what she did. We'd met at a conference in downtown Nashville when she was 26 and I was 30. She was presenting a panel on healthcare fraud detection. I was in the audience because a client of mine had asked me to attend. We ended up at the same table at the dinner afterward and spent 2 hours arguing about methodology. She thought insurers overcomplicated fraud detection. I thought hospitals undercounted it. At the end of the night, she said she'd never met an investigator who understood hospital billing. I said I'd never met a finance officer who understood claims. We were both exaggerating, but it was the kind of exaggeration that starts something. We were together for 23 years, married when I was 30 and she was 26, raised 2 sons, built 2 properties, the house where we lived in Green Hills and the second one in Germantown, which I'd bought as an investment when a settlement on a large commercial fraud case paid out better than expected. I'd done most of the restoration work on the Germantown house myself over the course of 2 years, and by the time it was finished, it was worth considerably more than I'd paid for it. There was one thing we did every week without fail, from the time the boys were small. Sunday morning, a long breakfast, not the rushed weekday kind, the one you eat standing up while you check your phone. Sunday breakfast was sitting down, with biscuits from Loveless Cafe if I'd made the drive early enough, or homemade if I hadn't, eggs and bacon, coffee that sat on the table for an hour. We stayed there at least 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. When the boys were little, they'd come to the table in pajamas and turn the whole thing into organized chaos. Then they grew up and left, and breakfast was just us 2. That continued even after the boys were gone. It was one of the few things we still did together, unhurried, without agenda. I know how that sounds now, but at the time, that breakfast convinced me things were okay, or at least that they could stay that way. The signal I ignored was quiet. For about 2 years before all of this, Sandra had been spending weekend afternoons more often at Brianna's parents' house than at home. She said she was helping Brianna through the pregnancy, then with the baby. I thought it was natural. I thought it was admirable, even, an involved mother-in-law, a close family. It didn't occur to me to ask why the help was offered with such frequency and such consistency, with visit schedules that looked more like a work calendar than a family drop-in. I was busy with cases. I always was. What changed wasn't a confrontation, it was a spreadsheet. In January of that year, I was pulling together paperwork to renew the insurance on the Germantown property. I needed the current deed reference number, and since the physical folder was in the drawer of my home office, I went to get it. The home office was a small room at the back of the house. I'd converted from a storage space, a wooden desk that had come from my father's house in Clarksville, shelves lined with closed cases going back 15 years, and that center drawer where I kept documents that needed to be accessible but were rarely needed. I opened the drawer, pulled out the property folder. Inside, alongside the documents I was looking for, was an envelope I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. Not my handwriting. Sandra's name written on the front in blue pen with a date from 6 months earlier. I should have put it back. I didn't. Inside the envelope was a printed spreadsheet, 2 pages. The first listed the Germantown property, the address on Monroe Street, the square footage, a market value estimate she'd put at $840,000, and a series of projected dates spread across 18 months. The second page had references to a title company in Brentwood, a LLC name I didn't recognize, and a final column she'd labeled simply Estimated Transfer Date. I stood there holding both pages long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. The spreadsheet had no signature, no name indicating who'd prepared it, but the footer at the bottom of the second page had a small detail I only noticed because I held the paper up to the window light. It was the document template that Riverside Medical Center used for internal financial planning. I knew because I'd seen that template before when Sandra had asked me to review a capital expenditure proposal she was preparing for the board, 40-some pages of projections and analysis. The specific font, the margin width, the gray footer with its thin separator line, it was identical. She'd prepared that document at work, using hospital resources to plan what to do with my property. I put the envelope back in the folder exactly as I'd found it, put the folder in the drawer in the same position, closed the drawer, went to the kitchen, put fresh water in the coffee maker, made a second cup. I didn't say a word to anyone that day. But over the days that followed, I started paying attention to things I'd been letting pass. Sandra had a habit of working on her laptop at the kitchen table after dinner. She'd done it for years. Budget reports, board presentations, fiscal year projections. I'd never paid close attention because there'd been no reason to. A week after finding the envelope, I walked behind her while she was working. Not deliberately, I was going to the kitchen for water, and I caught the screen for less than 3 seconds before she minimized the window in a motion that wasn't quite casual. It was a title company form. I couldn't read the content, but the header I recognized. It was the standard template for a deed transfer application. I had filled out an identical form when I purchased the Germantown property. She turned and asked if I wanted water too. I said yes. She got up, came back with 2 glasses. We stood there a moment, and then she returned to the laptop. When I passed behind her again on the way back to the living room, the screen showed a hospital departmental budget. Now there were 2 things, the spreadsheet and the transfer form. I went to the Davidson County Register of Deeds the following week on a Tuesday morning. I requested a property title search on the Germantown address. It's a matter of public record. Anyone can request it. You pay a small fee, and the results come back within a few days. I knew this the way I knew most things about documentation, because I'd done it hundreds of times professionally. Before any transaction involving real property, you run the title. You look for liens, encumbrances, anything that clouds ownership. That's the first rule. I taught it to clients for years. I just never applied it to my own name. The report came back by email 4 days later on a Friday afternoon. I read it at my desk at the office, read it again, then printed it, and read it a 3rd time with the door closed. There was a mortgage recorded against the Germantown property. Amount $112,000. Date of recording 21 months prior. Lender, a private lending company I recognized. They operated in the residential and commercial lending space across Middle Tennessee. Fairly common for asset-backed loans. The borrower listed on the instrument was Dale Mercer. I had never taken out that loan. I need to tell you what I felt in that moment because it wasn't what you're probably expecting. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling I get when I'm working a fraud case and I pull the transaction records, and what I find isn't an isolated irregularity. It's a pattern, something that was built deliberately over time by someone who understood what they were doing. You don't get angry at the records. You document them. You measure the exposure. You figure out how far back it goes, and you decide, with the same cold clarity you'd bring to any investigation, what the correct response is. I sat there with the report in my hand for a while. Then I folded it, put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, and drove to a 2:00 meeting with a client about a commercial arson case in Murfreesboro. The meeting ran 90 minutes. The client was thorough and exacting. We closed the scope. In the parking lot afterward, I sat in my truck for 20 minutes without starting the engine. $112,000. My name. My signature, presumably. A loan I never signed for, on a property I had bought with money I had earned, backing a debt I knew nothing about. 20 minutes. Then I started the truck and drove home. That night, Sandra got home around 7:30. She had grocery bags. She stopped at the Publix on the way back from work on Tuesdays, always had. She said hello, asked if I'd eaten, said she'd put together something quick because she was tired. I said I'd help. We cooked together for 20 minutes. She cut tomatoes. I heated the pan. She stirred while I put pasta on to boil. Owen came home 15 minutes later, dropped his bag on the couch, and came straight to the kitchen. We ate dinner, the 3 of us. We talked about Owen's thesis, about a physician at the hospital who was giving Sandra headaches over a procurement decision, about a show we'd both been watching in pieces for 2 weeks. I participated the way I always did. I asked about the physician. I said we could finish the show on the weekend. Inside, I was working the case. I wasn't going to ask anything. Not yet. I needed to understand the full scope before I showed my hand, because if I asked now, without documentation, without evidence, she couldn't redirect. She would control the narrative. She was very good at controlling narratives. It was part of her job. I needed her not to know that I knew, at least for a while longer. I went to bed at 11. She slept beside me the way she always did, on her side, arm tucked under the pillow, breathing slow and even. I lay on my back, looking at the ceiling for an hour and a half. I thought about Sunday breakfasts, about 23 years, about the boys showing up to the table in pajamas, about the conference dinner where we'd spent 2 hours arguing methodology. Then I stopped thinking about that and started thinking about what I needed to do. There was a man named Frank Colby, who I'd known since I was 12 years old. We grew up 3 houses apart in Clarksville, played baseball together through high school, drifted into different lives after graduation. I went into insurance. Frank went to law school at University of Tennessee, spent 12 years at a firm in Memphis doing real estate and family law, then moved back to Nashville and opened his own practice. We'd stayed in touch the way old friends do, texts on birthdays, a beer 2 or 3 times a year, the kind of friendship that doesn't need maintenance to stay solid. Frank was 59. His office was in Brentwood, a 15-minute drive south. He had a reputation for being meticulous and direct, which was accurate. He also had a reputation for not telling clients what they wanted to hear, which was equally accurate and considerably more valuable. I called him on a Wednesday morning. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Frank, I need to see you today if you can make time." He said, "I've got a gap at 11. Come in." I went in at 11. His office was the way Frank's spaces always were, clean, functional, no decoration that wasn't also useful. I put the title report on his desk. I showed him the photograph I'd taken of the spreadsheet the day I found it. I'd photographed both pages before putting the envelope back, not knowing exactly why at the time. Investigator's habit: document before you disturb. Frank read everything without comment. Then he set it down and looked at me. He said, "Have you requested the original loan documents from the lender?" I said no. I didn't know how to do that without alerting anyone to the fact that I was looking. He said, "I can request them with a formal letter of representation. As your attorney, I have standing. They'll produce the instrument with the signature that was used to execute it." He asked a few more questions. Whether I had joint bank accounts with Sandra, whether I'd ever signed documents she handed me without reading them carefully, whether she had routine access to my ID and social security card. On that last one, I stopped. She did. We kept important documents in a shared file cabinet in the home office. She'd organized that system herself early in the marriage. She knew exactly where everything was. Frank wrote something down on the legal pad in front of him. Then he said, "Dale, here's what I think is happening. I've seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize the shape of it. Someone who understands financial instruments and has access to your identifying information can execute a mortgage without your knowledge. It's a crime. What we need is the original loan document with the signature, and then an independent forensic document examiner to compare it to known samples of your signature." I asked how long it would take. He said, 3 weeks for the loan documents, 10 business days for the examination. Call it 5 or 6 weeks total. If the signature doesn't match, and based on what you've told me, I'd expect it won't, we have the foundation for a criminal complaint, a civil action to discharge the lien, and a divorce proceeding with full asset disclosure. I said, "What about the transfer spreadsheet? That looks like the next step after the mortgage." He said, "Sell the property to pay off the loan, net the proceeds, and move them wherever she wanted. With the mortgage in your name, the sale would look clean from the outside. Notary wouldn't flag it. Title company might not either if the paperwork was in order." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked, "Is there anything else I should be doing right now?" He said, "Keep your routine. Don't change anything. Don't let her know you're looking. That part's going to be the hardest." I said, "I've worked surveillance cases for 20 years, Frank." He said, "I know." But this one's different. This one's in your house. He was right about that. The weeks that followed were the hardest I've lived through, not because I was visibly struggling, but because I wasn't, and had to keep not being. I was operating normally on the surface, while underneath I was building the thing that needed to be built. Every morning, I got up, made coffee, drove to the office, worked cases. I had 3 active investigations at the time: a staged vehicle accident in Franklin, a workers' comp fraud involving a roofing contractor in Smyrna, and a business interruption claim from a restaurant fire in downtown Nashville that had inconsistencies I'd been tracking for 6 weeks. I worked all 3. I billed my hours, I filed my reports. In the evenings I came home, had dinner, watched whatever was on, normal, domestic, functional. There was a Thursday when Sandra took a call during dinner and excused herself to take it on the back porch. She was out there about 12 minutes, speaking in a voice calibrated to be quiet, but not absent, the tone of someone who doesn't want to be heard, but also doesn't want to appear to be hiding. When she came back in, she said it was a board member with concerns about the upcoming audit. I said, "Everything okay?" She said, "Just politics. You know how it is." She smiled, picked up her fork, went back to eating. I went back to eating too, but I looked at her for a second. That specific smile I'd known for 23 years, that particular way she had of re-entering a conversation as though whatever had happened outside had already been processed and filed, and I thought, she's good at this. She always was. What unsettled me wasn't the discovery that she was concealing something. It was realizing she was doing it with the same ease she brought to everything else. No visible tension, no weight showing through. The way someone performs a skill they've had long enough that it stopped costing them effort. The loan documents arrived at Frank's office in 19 days. He called me on a Thursday morning to say they'd come in. I went over that afternoon. It was a standard deed of trust. The instrument used for mortgage lending in Tennessee. 16 pages. Borrower, Dale Mercer. My social security number, my driver's license number, my address, my date of birth. Everything correct. The signature wasn't mine. I know my signature the way you know your own handwriting after 30 years of professional use. I know where the pen accelerates, where it slows. I know how the D opens. I know how the final R in Mercer curves back and closes. The signature on the document had the general appearance of mine, close enough to pass a casual glance from someone who'd seen me sign a few times. But the internal details, the micro movements that distinguish one person's signature from an imitation, were wrong in ways I recognized immediately. Frank said he'd send it to the document examiner that same afternoon. While he was doing that, I asked, where did the money go? He'd already traced it. The proceeds from the loan, $112,000, had been deposited to a personal account held in Sandra's name, not her hospital account, a separate personal banking account I hadn't known existed. From that account, 2 weeks after the deposit, $94,000 had been transferred to a title company in Brentwood as a down payment. I asked, down payment on what? Frank pulled a second document from the folder, a deed of trust on a condominium in the 12 South neighborhood of Nashville. 2 bedrooms, 1,400 square feet. Purchased 20 months ago. Owner of record, Sandra Jean Pruitt. Her maiden name. She'd used my property to finance a condo she'd bought in her name alone. A property I didn't know existed. I sat in the chair across from Frank's desk for a moment. Then I asked, "Is there a tenant?" Frank said. I looked into that. The unit has been rented since the month after purchase, month-to-month lease. The rental income goes directly to her personal account. She had used my name, my property, and a signature she forged to build herself a second income stream. Quietly, systematically, while I was working cases in Murfreesboro and refinishing floors in Germantown on my weekends. I said, "How long has the lease been active?" He said, 19 months. I folded my hands on the edge of his desk and looked at them for a few seconds. Then I said, "Let's wait for the document examination report. When we have it, we move on all 3 fronts at once." He said, "Agreed. One more thing to consider, Dale. There may be more. If she did this once with access to your documents and your signature, there's no structural reason she couldn't have done it more than once." I said, "Run a full title search on everything in my name." He said, "Already ordered it. I drove back to East Nashville in the late afternoon, the city sliding past the windows the way it does when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I had a deposition to prepare for the next morning. I went home. I made dinner. I ate with Sandra. She told me about her day. I listened. I responded. I was very good at listening. The forensic document examination report came back 11 days later. 8 pages of technical analysis comparing the signature on the deed of trust against 4 authenticated samples of my signature. The deed to the Germantown property, 2 signed contracts from insurance clients, a notarized affidavit from a case that had gone to trial. The examiner compared pressure distribution, pen angle, entry and exit strokes, letter proportion, and relative sizing of signature elements. The conclusion was direct. The signature on the deed of trust was not consistent to a high degree of examiner certainty with the known writing samples of Dale Mercer. Frank laid the report on the desk and said, "We have what we need. Criminal complaint to the DA's office for fraud and forgery, civil action to discharge the lien and recover the full amount with interest, divorce filing with full financial disclosure demand, and asset tracing." I asked, "The condo?" He said, "We'll petition the court to freeze it pending the civil proceeding. She can't sell or encumber it while the case is active." I asked, "What's the timing?" He said, "That's your decision. We can file tomorrow, or we can wait. Every additional day of documentation makes the case stronger, but what we have now is already more than sufficient." I said, "I need a week. One conversation before anything gets filed." He understood without me explaining. Caleb didn't know anything. I was certain of that, but I needed to hear it. My older son is 29. He works in operations management for a logistics company in Nashville. Detail-oriented, methodical, not unlike his father in ways that sometimes surprised me. He married Brianna 2.5 years ago. They were expecting their second child. I asked him to meet me for breakfast on a Saturday morning at a diner on Nolansville Pike that we'd been going to together since he was a teenager. Without Brianna, just us. He was already there when I arrived. Coffee in front of him. The expression of a man who knows something significant is coming and doesn't know what shape it's going to take. I sat down. I told him everything, from the envelope in the drawer to the forensic report. He listened without interrupting, both elbows on the table, eyes steady on my face. When I finished, he was quiet long enough that I knew he was processing it, not preparing an answer. Then he said, "Dad, I heard Brianna mention the Germantown house. She said your mom had told her that one day it was going to be theirs, hers, and mine. I didn't push on it because I figured it was one of those family comments people make about the future. I didn't imagine there was anything concrete behind it." I asked, "How did that make you feel when you heard it?" He said, "Uncomfortable, but I let it go." I looked at my son. He had his hands around the coffee cup, looking at the table with the expression of someone rereading old conversations in a new light. I said, "You didn't do anything wrong. You had no way of knowing what was underneath it." He said, "And Brianna, did she know?" I said, "I don't believe she did, but that's going to be a conversation you have with her when the time is right. What I need from you right now is to keep your routine. Don't say anything to Brianna. Don't say anything to your mother. Don't do anything different from what you normally do. When it's resolved, you'll be the first to know everything." He said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I am," and I was. In the way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been through something like it. The way you're okay in the middle of a difficult case when the work is clear and the direction is set and there's no room in your head for anything else. Not happiness, clarity, a single line without branches. I hugged my son on the sidewalk outside the diner. He held on a second longer than usual. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us needed to. I drove back to East Nashville, called Frank, said, "File Monday." Frank filed on a Monday morning. 3 simultaneous instruments, a criminal complaint to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office with the forensic examination report, a certified copy of the deed of trust, and documentation tracing the loan proceeds to Sandra's personal account and from there to the condo purchase, a civil action to discharge the fraudulent lien against the Germantown property with recovery of the full amount plus interest from the date of recording, and a divorce petition with a comprehensive asset disclosure demand and a motion to freeze all identified real property pending a full financial investigation. That afternoon, a process server went to Riverside Medical Center with the civil complaint. Frank called me at 4:12 to confirm that service had been completed, the documents received by a member of Sandra's administrative staff. I thanked him, hung up, went back to the business interruption file I'd been working on all week, worked for another 2 hours. Then I closed the file, shut the computer, and drove to the grocery store to buy what I needed for a pot roast. Sandra got home at 7:40. I was in the kitchen, slow-cooked pot roast, the kind I made on Sunday afternoons when I had time, chuck roast with carrots and potatoes and a bay leaf. The sort of thing that fills the whole house with something that smells like it's always been there. I'd started it at 5, and it had been going low and slow for almost 3 hours. She came in, set her bag on the chair by the door, came to the entrance of the kitchen. She stood in the doorway for about 3 seconds. The change she saw in me must have been small, almost invisible, but Sandra was good at reading rooms. That was part of what made her effective at her job. 23 years of marriage had given her a precise map of my baseline. She said, "You were served too?" I said, "I'm the one who filed." She was quiet. She looked at the pot on the stove, at the cutting board where I'd left the vegetable scraps, at my hands, which had gone still on the counter. Then she said, "I needed that money. The hospital was looking at cuts to my department. I had a window to act, and I acted. You would never have agreed if I'd asked." I said, "You didn't ask." She said, "You know how you are about money, Dale. Every dollar has to be justified to you. It would have been a 6-month argument, and we both know it." I said, "What you thought about how I manage money is a conversation we could have had. What you did with my name and my property without my knowledge is a different thing entirely." She looked at me. I could see her working it, looking for the opening, the place where the husband of 23 years would surface and make room for a longer explanation, for the context that would reduce what was sitting on the table between us. She was skilled at finding those openings. She'd spent her career finding them. There wasn't one. "You built that house, Dale," she said after a silence. "I built the life that's going to outlast it. I think that's a fair trade." I didn't respond. I turned off the burner, put the lid on the pot, folded the dish towel that had been over my shoulder and set it on the counter. Said, "The attorneys will be in touch. If you want this to move efficiently, respond to the filings without delay." I went to the bedroom, picked up the bag I'd packed 4 days earlier, not dramatically, with the same logic I'd bring to packing for a long work trip. Came back down the hall. Owen was in the entryway with his keys still in his hand, clearly just arriving, looking at the bag and then at me. He said, "Dad," I said, "I'll explain everything, son. Not tonight. Soon, I promise." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am." I opened the front door, stepped out, pulled it closed behind me carefully. Not slammed, just closed. The way you close the door on a room you won't be going back into. I spent 3 weeks in a short-term rental in East Nashville while the proceedings moved forward. It was a small, furnished apartment on Shelby Avenue, 1 bedroom, a window looking out onto a magnolia tree that was already starting to bud even in early March. It was quiet. That was the main thing. I got up at 6, made coffee, worked, had lunch, worked more, made dinner, slept, On the Saturday of the second week, I went to see Frank, not at his office, at a bar we'd been going to since our 30s, a low-key place in Hillsborough Village with good bourbon and no televisions. We sat at the corner of the bar. He asked how things were going. I told him the legal part, that the filings had been accepted, that Sandra had retained an attorney within 48 hours of service, that the asset investigation was underway. Then he asked, "How are you doing?" Not about the case, about me. I thought about it for a genuine moment before I answered. I said, "I've been realizing that for a long time I confused being busy with being present. I was always working a case, always building something, always solving somebody else's problem. I thought that keeping everything running was the same as being there. It isn't. Those are completely different things. I just spent 20 years not knowing the difference." Frank turned his glass in his hands, looked at the bar, then looked at me. He said, "Most men don't figure that out until something forces them to." I said, "I know." He said, "The ones who figure it out are the lucky ones, even if the way they get there doesn't feel like luck at the time." We sat with that for a while, finished our drinks. He told me about a property dispute case that was giving him trouble, a boundary line disagreement between two neighbors in Franklin that had turned uglier than it had any right to be. I gave him my read on it. We had another round. I drove home on a clear March night with the windows down, the city smelling the way Nashville smells in early spring, cut grass and something sweet from the trees along the boulevard. I parked on Shelby Avenue and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going inside, not because I was upset, just because it was a good night to sit. The full title investigation that Frank ran took 5 more weeks. The results were what we'd already documented, and nothing beyond them. The deed of trust on the Germantown property with the forged signature, the loan proceeds traced to the undisclosed personal account, and from there to the condo purchase in Sandra's maiden name. No other encumbrances in my name that I hadn't authorized, no other accounts, just the one instrument. Frank said, "Dale, this is a strong case. I don't have any doubt about the outcome." I asked about the condo. He said, "The civil motion to freeze it was granted. She can't sell or transfer it while the proceeding is active. When the case resolves, you'll have a claim against that asset for the amount of the lien, plus costs and interest." I asked about the Germantown property. He said, "The fraudulent mortgage will be discharged by court order. The property comes back to you clean. Whatever equity she encumbered gets restored." I asked about Caleb, about Brianna's family. He said, "Brianna's parents were occupying the property based on a promise that had no legal basis. When the attempted transfer falls apart, that promise doesn't exist in any enforceable sense. The conversation about how they vacate the property is a practical one between you and your son, not a legal matter for this proceeding." I knew. Caleb and I had been having that conversation in pieces. 2 months ago, I moved into an apartment in East Nashville, 2 blocks from my office on Gallatin Pike. 2 bedrooms. 1 actual bedroom. The other converted to an office where the boxes from the investigation were stacked until I finally filed them properly. A small deck facing the street with one of those old elm trees that Nashville has in its older neighborhoods, the kind that's been there since before any of the houses around it. I get up at 6, make coffee. On Saturday mornings, I drive to the farmer's market on 8th Avenue, the one that's been there for 30 years. Same vendors in the same spots, people who've been coming to the same stalls since before I was doing it. I buy whatever looks good. I walk back to the truck with the bags. My sons come by. Caleb is going through a hard stretch with Brianna. What happened between Sandra and me surfaced a series of conversations Brianna had had with her parents about the Germantown house. Conversations that Caleb hadn't known had taken place the way they had. They're working through it. I stay out of it. It's their story. Owen helped me set up the apartment the first 2 weekends after I moved in. He brought tools, assembled shelves, hung the 2 pictures I'd taken from the Green Hills house, both of them mine before the marriage, paintings I'd bought at an art fair in Nashville in my late 20s. On the second Sunday afternoon, when we were having coffee on the deck watching the street, he said, "Dad, you seem different." I asked, "Different how?" He said, "More like yourself. Like you stopped waiting for something to go wrong." I looked at the elm tree, the way the late afternoon light came through it at that angle, thought that he was right, though I couldn't have said exactly when the change had happened. Maybe in Frank's office on a November afternoon, holding a title report with a number in it that I'd never authorized. Maybe in the parking lot in Murfreesboro, sitting in my truck with the engine off, 20 minutes longer than I needed to. Maybe earlier than any of that. Maybe the moment I found that envelope in the drawer and instead of putting it back and pretending nothing had happened, took out my phone and photographed both pages. Investigators have it. Document before you disturb. There's something I want to talk about that I learned from all of this. Not as a lesson, because it's not that simple. It's more like an observation from inside the work. I spent 20 years investigating fraud. What fraud cases taught me, over and over again, is that the best schemes are built inside relationships, not on strangers, on people who trust you, because trust is the one control that turns itself off voluntarily. You don't check what you trust. That's the whole point. The most sophisticated fraud I ever uncovered wasn't technically complex. It was relationally precise. The person executing it knew exactly which questions the other person would never think to ask. In my professional life, I learned to ask the questions anyway. It was my job not to trust at face value, to verify, to pull the documentation, to follow the money wherever it led, regardless of who was at the end of the trail. In my own life, I didn't do that. I built the house. I kept the finances running. I showed up to the important things and did the work on the weekends and made pot roast on Sunday afternoons. I produced the surface of a stable marriage, and I stopped looking underneath it, because looking underneath it felt like an accusation, and I didn't want to be the man who accused the person he'd chosen to build his life with. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up as trust. I'm not saying what Sandra did was caused by my inattention. What she did was a deliberate choice, planned and executed with care. The responsibility is entirely hers, but I learned, in the clearest possible way, that there are things in your own life that you have to investigate, the same way you'd investigate anything else. Not because you don't trust the person beside you, because trust isn't a substitute for knowledge, because the phrase "I trust you" is not the same sentence as "I understand what's happening." You can love someone and still ask the question. You can commit to someone and still read the document before you sign it. Those aren't contradictions. Those are just things I'm saying at 52 that I should have understood at 30. How long have you been letting trust substitute for attention in something that matters to you? That's not an accusation. It's the question I ask myself now, the way I'd ask it at the start of any case. What do I actually know, and what am I just assuming? Before I go, a few questions I want to leave with you. If you'd been in that kitchen, bag packed in the bedroom, pot roast going on the stove, and her telling you it was a fair trade, what would you have said to her? Or what wouldn't you have said that I also didn't say? And here's one that stayed with me. Is there a difference between trusting someone and simply never looking? Because I thought those were the same thing for a long time. I don't anymore. And the last one, the one I keep coming back to, do you believe a person shows you who they really are not when things are going well for them, but when things are going badly for someone they were supposed to love? Leave your answer in the comments. I mean it. Not a rhetorical question. I want to know what you think. If this story landed somewhere for you, hit like. If you know someone going through something like this, someone who feels the floor shifting under them and doesn't know yet if there's still structure underneath, share this video with them. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is say, listen to this, subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's a new story, and they're all about the same thing, what a man does when he finds out the foundation wasn't what he thought it was. Discovers he still has when he stops building for everyone else and starts paying attention to what's actually his. Until next time.